November 24th, 1863, Chattanooga, Tennessee. The air smells of wood smoke, river mud, and the slow, patient rot of an army that has been starving for 2 months. The Tennessee River runs gray and cold along the valley floor. Above the town, like a crooked spine rising out of the earth, Missionary Ridge dominates the horizon, 500 feet of rock and pine, and at the top, dug deep into the clay, 30,000 Confederate soldiers with cannons aimed straight down at everything that moves below. The men of the Army of the Cumberland know exactly what they look like from up there. They know they look like targets. They have been looking up at that ridge since September, since Chickamauga, since the day the entire Union Army was shattered in a Tennessee forest and only one man's stubbornness kept it from being completely destroyed. That man is standing right now on a muddy knoll called Orchard Knob, wrapped in a dark overcoat, studying the ridge through field glasses with the expression of someone calculating the exact weight of an impossible thing. His name is George Henry Thomas, and in approximately 24 hours, he is going to make a decision that his commanding general never authorized. A decision that will horrify that commanding general in the moment it is made. A decision that should, by every rule of war, result in catastrophe. Instead, it will crack the backbone of the Confederate Army of Tennessee and change the course of the war. But first, understand the trap. To understand what is about to happen at Missionary Ridge, you have to go back 60 days and feel what it meant to be the Army of the Cumberland in September of 1863. They were not a beaten army in the conventional sense. They had won a campaign. They had maneuvered Braxton Bragg's Confederate forces out of Chattanooga, a vital railroad junction, through sheer operational skill. General William Rosecrans had used geography like a weapon, and for a brief, beautiful moment, the campaign looked like a masterpiece. Then Chickamauga, September 19th and 20th. 2 days in a forest that swallowed regiments whole. The battle was chaos. The sounds of combat surrounded men on all sides. Visibility was measured in feet. Lines dissolved. Units collided in the dark. And on the afternoon of the second day, a gap opened in the Union right flank, and the Confederate Army poured through it like water through a broken dam. The Union Army disintegrated. Generals grabbed their horses and rode hard for Chattanooga. Rosecrans himself fled. His corps commanders fled. It was a rout so complete that Union soldiers later described not knowing whether to run north or east, or simply fall down and wait to be captured. One man did not run. Major General George H. Thomas was a Virginian who had chosen the Union. He was not a flashy commander. He did not ride into battle with a sword raised overhead. He was a heavy, deliberate man who moved slowly and thought carefully and, when threatened, became approximately as movable as a granite cliff. On the afternoon of September 20th, with the Union Army collapsing on all sides, Thomas took what men he had left, anchored them to a rocky spur called Snodgrass Hill, and simply refused to leave. Wave after wave of Confederate infantry crashed against his position. They were turned back. They came again. They were turned back again. Thomas held until dark. He held until the survivors of the shattered army had escaped. He held until he was almost completely surrounded. And then, only then, in good order, he withdrew. The newspapers called him the Rock of Chickamauga, but the Rock was trapped. Bragg followed up, laid siege to Chattanooga, and within weeks the Army of the Cumberland was starving. The supply lines were cut. The men were eating half rations, then quarter rations. The horses were dying by the hundreds. Their bodies littered the roads leading into town. The stench was unbearable. Mules were found dead in their traces, too weak to pull empty wagons. Washington was in panic. Lincoln needed someone who could fix this. He sent Ulysses S. Grant. Grant arrived in Chattanooga on October 23, 1863. He had just been given command of all Union forces in the Western Theater. He was riding with a shattered leg, his horse having fallen on him, so he was lifted off his horse and carried into Thomas's headquarters. The first thing Grant did was look at the maps. The second thing Grant did was send orders. And the tension between what Grant wanted and what Thomas was willing to do began almost immediately. Grant was an attacking general. He had taken Fort Donelson, survived Shiloh, strangled Vicksburg into surrender. His philosophy of war was motion, strike, press, do not stop, do not give the enemy time to breathe. Delay was to Grant almost a moral failing. It meant more days of war, more days of dying. Thomas was a different kind of soldier. He was methodical. He prepared. He made sure before he moved. His men had just come through the trauma of Chickamauga, and they were starving, and their equipment was in ruins, and Thomas intended to rebuild before he threw those men against a fortified mountain. The two men were, in temperament and style, almost perfectly opposed. Grant pushed Thomas to act. Thomas pushed back, quietly, stubbornly, without drama or defiance, simply requiring that the preconditions for success actually exist before he asked men to advance into canister fire. Grant grew frustrated. There were moments in October when Grant seriously considered relieving Thomas from command. He had the authority, he had the temptation. What stopped him was the simple fact that there was no one else. Thomas was the army. The army trusted Thomas with a ferocity that bordered on reverence. You do not remove the rock from the foundation and expect the building to stand. Grant held his patience. He opened the supply lines. Food poured back in. The men recovered their strength. The horses recovered. The plan for breaking the siege of Chattanooga came together in November, and when Grant laid it out, the role he assigned to Thomas told you everything about how he saw their relationship. The plan was a three-part operation. On the far left, General William Sherman would strike the northern end of Missionary Ridge with 4 full corps. That was the main attack. Sherman would roll up the ridge from the north, and the Confederate defenders would collapse southward under that pressure. This was Grant's plan. Sherman was Grant's man, brought in from the west, trusted completely. On the far right, General Joe Hooker would clear Confederate forces from Lookout Mountain, the dramatic pinnacle on the south end of the valley. This was the sideshow, the spectacular demonstration that would eventually become mythologized as the Battle Above the Clouds. And in the center, covering the valley floor between them, George Thomas and the Army of the Cumberland would make a demonstration. A limited advance. They would move forward, pressure the Confederate rifle pits at the very base of Missionary Ridge, keep Bragg from reinforcing his flanks, and wait. That was it, a demonstration. An army of 60,000 men used as a distraction, while Sherman did the actual work. Thomas received the orders without visible complaint. He nodded, he planned, he prepared his men. But if you knew Thomas, if you had watched the way he stood on Snodgrass Hill and looked at what was happening around him and simply refused to accept it, you understood something about the man that the orders couldn't contain. Thomas did not tell Grant he disagreed. He had fought that battle before and lost it. But George Thomas had spent 2 months looking up at Missionary Ridge. He had watched his men stare at it through hollow, starving eyes. He knew what that army would do when it was finally pointed at the high ground and told to move. November 23rd. The preliminary movements begin. Thomas sends 2 divisions forward and, in a brief, fierce fight, seizes a low rise called Orchard Knob directly in front of Missionary Ridge. Grant watches from the captured knoll. Thomas stands beside him. The ridge looms above them both, its crest broken by gun pits and artillery emplacements, Confederate flags moving in the cold wind. It is close enough that men on the ridge can watch Grant through their own field glasses. November 24th. Hooker sweeps Lookout Mountain. Sherman begins his attack on the north end of the ridge. And here, the plan begins to come apart. Sherman attacks through the night and into the morning of November 25th. He hits what he believes is the northern tip of Missionary Ridge. What he does not know, because the maps are wrong, is that he has struck not the end of the ridge, but an isolated knoll separated from the main ridge by a ravine. He is fighting a detached hill. The real northern tip of Missionary Ridge is still intact, defended by Patrick Cleburne, arguably the finest division commander in the Confederate Army. Cleburne pins Sherman down with a ferocity that stops the main assault cold. Sherman bleeds into the November afternoon and gains almost nothing. Grant stands on Orchard Knob watching the smoke billow from the north end of the ridge. The plan is failing. He needs to do something. He needs to create pressure somewhere else, force Bragg to move troops away from Cleburne, create space for Sherman to push. He turns to Thomas. He issues the order. Take the rifle pits at the base of Missionary Ridge. That is the order. Not the ridge, not the crest. The rifle pits. The first line of Confederate entrenchments at the base of the slope. Go in, take those pits, create a distraction, hold there. Thomas nods. The order goes out. The signal guns fire. And in the valley below Orchard Knob, 60,000 men begin to move forward. What happens next is one of the most spontaneous, terrifying, and ultimately inexplicable events in American military history. The Army of the Cumberland advances in 4 lines, dressed and measured, with the order of a parade, 6 divisions, 20,000 men in the first wave alone. The late afternoon sun is low and cold, catching the bayonets and the regimental colors. The Confederate artillery on the ridge opens up. The shells scream down, men fall, the lines close and keep moving, faster now. The rifle pits at the base of the ridge are 200 yards out, 100. The Confederates in the lower rifle pits see what's coming. They fire, they reload, they fire again. The Union infantry does not slow down. They take the rifle pits in a rush. Rebels are captured, rebels flee. The first line of the Confederate position falls in minutes, and then the men stop. They are in the rifle pits at the base of Missionary Ridge. They have followed their orders exactly. They have done what Grant told them to do, and they are dying. From above, from the crest of the ridge 500 feet overhead, Confederate artillery and musketeers are pouring fire straight down into the captured pits. The geography of the battlefield has created a killing ground that no one fully anticipated in the planning. The rifle pits are not shelter. They are a trap. The Union men are packed into shallow earthworks with lead coming down from above at nearly vertical angles. They cannot stay. They cannot retreat across the open field they just crossed without being cut down. There is only one option. No one ordered it. There was no bugle call. No officer rode down the line and waved his saber. What happened next came from somewhere below rank and command and military doctrine. It came from the accumulated rage and humiliation of 2 months of starvation and impotence and staring up at that ridge. It came from Chickamauga. It came from the horses dead in the road. It came from the bones of men buried in the mud of the valley floor. The men of the Army of the Cumberland began to climb. It started at regimental level, then spread, a ripple of motion that became a wave before anyone above the rank of private understood what was happening. Men stood up from the rifle pits and walked into the fire. They grabbed at rock outcroppings and pulled themselves up. They pushed past the men above them. They screamed. Not orders, not tactics, just sound. The same sound they had given at Chickamauga when the world was ending around them. The rebel yell answered from above. The smoke turned the sky orange. Men were shot and rolled back down the slope. The men behind them stepped over them and kept climbing. On Orchard Knob, Ulysses S. Grant watches through his field glasses. His cigar goes cold in his hand. He turns to Thomas. His voice is hard, dangerous. "Thomas, who ordered those men up the ridge?" Thomas watches the slope through his own glasses. His face is unreadable. He is seeing something he did not plan and will not pretend he planned. But he is also seeing something he recognizes. He is seeing what his army does when it is finally pointed at the thing that has been torturing it and told, even partially, to move. "I don't know," Thomas says. "I did not." Grant turns to General Gordon Granger, the Corps commander standing nearby. "Did you order them up, Granger?" Granger shakes his head. He had not given the order. He had not given any order. The men were simply going. Grant's jaw tightens. He looks back at the ridge. 20,000 men are climbing. The Confederate fire is intense. The slope is steep. In every rational calculation, this attack should be destroyed. A frontal assault up a 500-foot mountain against entrenched defenders with artillery is precisely the kind of thing that creates the slaughters that end careers and fill newspapers for months. The charge at Missionary Ridge, attempted against orders, without artillery support, without coordination, without any of the careful preparation that Thomas had spent months insisting upon, it is the most dangerous kind of improvised madness. Grant says it quietly. Someone will answer for this if it doesn't work. It works. The Confederate line at the crest of Missionary Ridge, which Braxton Bragg had positioned poorly, placing his men at the summit rather than on the military crest where they could fire downward effectively, begins to crack. The Union soldiers are coming from below, yes, but they are coming in human density that the defenders cannot stop. They are using the dead ground in the folds of the slope to shelter between rushes. They are getting closer in dozens of separate charges across a front nearly a mile wide. The Confederates cannot bring their fire to bear on all of them simultaneously. The first Union soldiers reach the crest near the center of the line. A regimental flag plants itself on the ridge, then another, then another. The Confederate soldiers, seeing their flanks begin to give, watching the Union flags appear on the skyline above them, begin to break, not in sections or in units. The entire Confederate line on Missionary Ridge comes apart like a dam failing all at once. Men throw down their rifles, they run. Veterans who have stood under artillery fire for 2 years are running down the back of the ridge into the valley below, throwing away their equipment, abandoning their guns. Braxton Bragg tries to stop them. He rides among the fleeing men on horseback. He screams at them to stand. He blocks the road with his horse. They go around him. The Army of Tennessee is in full rout. On the summit, the Union soldiers scream until their voices give out. They fire at the retreating Confederates until the smoke is so thick they can no longer see. Grant, watching from Orchard Knob, says nothing for a long moment. Then he orders the pursuit. He never formally acknowledges what Thomas allowed to happen. He never says, in so many words, that the battle was won by an action he did not authorize. His after-action report attributes the charge to the instinct and aggression of the troops, the kind of credit that deflects the question of command without answering it. But the question hangs in the historical record, quiet and persistent. In the moment when the rifle pits became a death trap, George Thomas watched his men surge forward and chose not to stop them. He chose, in that particular silence, to let the army that he had rebuilt and fed and trained and sworn to protect go where it needed to go. That choice was not recklessness. It was the culmination of 2 months of intimate understanding of what his army needed. Thomas knew they would not be stopped by the position. He knew because he knew them. He had held the line with these men at Chickamauga when anyone else would have broken. He had watched them starve and refuse to surrender their dignity. He knew that when they stood up from those rifle pits, they were not making a tactical decision. They were settling a debt. Thomas was relieved that Grant was angry in the moment, but not ultimately wrong, because George Thomas was a man who understood the difference between an order and an outcome. Grant's order was tactical. Thomas's judgment was human. And in the algebra of that November afternoon, it was the human equation that solved the battle. The fall of Missionary Ridge effectively ended Confederate resistance in central Tennessee. Bragg resigned his command 4 days later, shattered and humiliated, and Jefferson Davis had to cast about desperately for a replacement to save what remained of the Army of Tennessee. The siege of Chattanooga, which had promised to starve the Union Army into submission, was over. The gateway to Georgia was open. The road to Atlanta, to Sherman's March, to the final breaking of the Confederacy's industrial heart, ran directly through the gap that Thomas's army tore in the Confederate line on the afternoon of November 25th. What Missionary Ridge reveals about leadership is something that military academies have wrestled with in the decades since. There is the doctrine of orders, precise and hierarchical and absolutely necessary in an industrial army, and there is the doctrine of judgment, the willingness to act on what you know rather than what you are told when the situation demands it. Thomas did not disobey Grant for personal glory. He was not a man who sought glory. He was a man who recognized the moment when his army had to be allowed to be what it was. The tragedy of George Thomas is that history has never fully given him the reckoning he deserves. Grant became president. Sherman became famous. Thomas became a monument in a park in Washington where very few people stopped to read the inscription. He was too quiet for mythology, too deliberate for the romantic narrative of the war, too dignified to fight the battles of reputation that lesser men fought in the newspapers. But on the slope of Missionary Ridge, on a cold November afternoon in 1863, when the most powerful commander in the Western theater asked who ordered those men up the ridge, there was only one man who knew the full answer. George Thomas watched his army climb, and he let them go. And because he did, the war ended sooner, in a less terrible way, than it might have. The greatest acts of command are sometimes not commands at all. They are the silence in which a leader recognizes what the moment is asking for, and steps back, and trusts the men who have already decided the answer.